In 1993, the world witnessed the emergence of one of the most iconic racing franchises, Ridge Racer. When I think of 90s and early 2000s racing games, Ridge Racer is one of the first names that comes to mind, alongside frontrunners like Need for Speed and Gran Turismo. Need for Speed and Gran Turismo had the edge in terms of global popularity and market dominance, but Ridge Racer was no slouch. It had its own distinct personality, and at the time brought something truly unique and special to the racing genre. Developed by Namco Studios, Ridge Racer was one of the best racers of its era. Since the series' debut on arcade systems in 1993, there have been over a dozen Ridge Racer titles, with the most recent one being a mobile game from 2016. For a series as legendary as Ridge Racer, it's truly a shame we haven't seen another release in nearly a decade. But as the saying goes, all good things must come to an end. However, between 1993 and 2016, the series was filled with innovation and truly unforgettable arcade racing classics. Namco created Ridge Racer as a project to show off the cutting-edge System 22. Now, when I say cutting-edge, this was about as cutting-edge as you could get back in 1993. It was an absolutely massive leap forward compared to the game consoles of the 80s. System 22 allowed for fully textured 3D polygonal graphics, which, in the early 90s, was about as cool could get. At a time when the gaming industry was still recovering from the crash and dark ages of the 80s, Ridge Racer was truly evolutionary and a bold statement in the gaming industry. Ridge Racer set the standard that the future is here, and it's fast, smooth, and sleek. This was a huge turning point for the racing genre. It set a new standard that major franchises like Gran Turismo and Need for Speed would adopt and use as a runway to become the absolute behemoths they are today. Fluid and stylish are the keywords used to describe Ridge Racer 1's gameplay. It wasn't trying to be realistic. It was all about fast drifting, popping visuals, and an iconic techno-infused soundtrack that instantly sucked you into the Ridge Racer world. It was cool. Very cool. While Gran Turismo focused on realism and car culture, and early Need for Speed titles leaned into exotic cars and road trips, Ridge Racer carved out a lane as being nothing but pure arcade fun. While Ridge Racer was smaller in scope compared to the future releases of Gran Turismo 1 and Need for Speed 1, it was fast, flashy, and laid back. It was the kind of game you could pick up and play and lose yourself in without the grind or time commitment of other games. The arcade version launched in 1993 in Japan and featured one track and 4 fictional cars. However, you could also unlock an additional 8 cars that could be obtained by beating a game of Galaxian with 100% of enemies defeated. That sounds underwhelming compared to modern day standards, but back in 1993, this was very impressive considering how much more technically and graphically advanced Ridge Racer was compared to the racing games preceding it. Despite having only one track, it was cleverly segmented into short and long versions, scaling with difficulty from novice to advanced. You also had time trial mode for the sweaty tryhards out there. And in the PlayStation port, it featured the iconic 13th racing car, otherwise known as the secret high-performance Devil Car. The gray speedster was unlockable upon beating certain opponents in the game's time trial mode. Time trial aside, the PlayStation port dropped in 1994 for North America and 1995 in Europe. A fun fact about the PlayStation port is that the game was loaded entirely into RAM, which was awesome, as it meant zero in-game loading times. That's something even games of today struggle to achieve. Besides that, the track design itself was memorable too, ranging from neon-lit downtown turns, scenic coastal stretches, and the legendary tunnel with the giant TV screen. Each area was truly unique and insanely fun. Everything about Ridge Racer 1 was incredible. Ridge Racer 2 Arcade is the next entry in the Ridge Racer series. Rather than being a true successor to Ridge Racer 1, Ridge Racer 2 Arcade was more like a Ridge Racer 1 upgrade pack. It kept the same single track of the original game, but tightened everything up and made everything smoother and more dynamic. It was basically Ridge Racer 1.5, but that wasn't a bad thing. Again, with this being 1994, Ridge Racer was already pushing the limits of what was possible back then. Notably, the game featured a rear-view mirror, day-to-night transitions, as well as a remix of the original soundtrack from Ridge Racer 1. While minor changes, they added a new layer of atmosphere to the game that made Ridge Racer all the better. One feature that stood out in particular, however, was the ability to link twin-screen cabinets. This allowed up to to 8 players to race together, which at the time was a huge deal. Each player's car was color-coded and themed after Namco classics like Rally X, Cybersled, and Dig Dug. Overall, while not as groundbreaking as the original Ridge Racer, Ridge Racer 2 was still an impressive title. It was a more polished, more social, and more refined Ridge Racer 1. It solidified the series as an absolute must-have for arcades around the globe. The year is 1995, and Namco is now fully in its arcade prime. This is the year Rave Racer came out, which was the next game in the Ridge Racer lineup. Like the first two, Rave Racer was built on System 22, and it took everything the series had done before and pushed it to new limits. Rather than offering one track like in the first two entries, Rave Racer featured 4 tracks. It also included an updated version of the original track found in Ridge Racer 1 and 2. Not only that, but it featured 2 new environments, one of them being a mountain course and the other being a vibrant urban cityscape. The visuals were cleaner, the sense of speed more intense, and the controls were drastically improved over the first 2 iterations. One of the most notable aspects of Rave Racer was the addition of force feedback steering. This made the game much more immersive due to the increased realism and connection with the game. Despite that, it still maintained the arcade feel Ridge Racer was so known for. Rave Racer also granted players the ability to switch between first-person and third-person camera views. The soundtrack also received a major overhaul. Powered by Namco's C352 audio chip, players had the ability to choose between 17 selectable tracks. Rave Racer became Japan's top-grossing arcade racer of 1996, and it marked the end of the arcade era for Ridge Racer before the series fully transitioned to home game consoles.
Hold up. Wait a minute. Something ain't right.
Hi, Editor Brad here. As I'm finishing up this Rave Racer section, it's come to my attention that the arcade port of Ridge Racer 5 was actually the last Ridge Racer title with an arcade release. I don't know how I missed that, but that's how it goes sometimes. So Rave Racer was not, in fact, the last arcade Ridge Racer, but rather the arcade port of Ridge Racer 5, known as Ridge Racer 5 Arcade Battle. Ridge Racer Revolution was the sequel to the PlayStation port of Ridge Racer 1. Like Ridge Racer 1, the game saw the return of the iconic 13th racing car, otherwise known as the Devil Car. The game also featured a couple other unlockable cars which were obtainable by completing certain challenges within the time trial mode. Like its predecessors, Ridge Racer Revolution featured novice, intermediate, and expert track variations. The game also supported Namco's wacky but brilliant Neo G-Con controller. This controller allowed players to make more precise steering thanks to the quirky and innovative design of the controller. With unlockable vehicles, time trials, and everything else Ridge Racer Revolution offered, the replayability factor of this game is what made it stand out. Not to mention the fact that, unlike the first 2 entries, Ridge Racer Revolution could be played from the comfort of your living room. Ridge Racer Revolution was a huge technological leap forward. With smoother graphics, improved draw distance, and more detailed environments than the original arcade Ridge Racer, it was proof that the series could continue to evolve on home consoles while staying true to its arcade roots. Rage Racer is next up in the Ridge Racer series. It was a bit of a departure from the games preceding it. Rage Racer leaned heavier into progression and customization rather than the quick race format of the prior games. For the first time, players could earn credits, buy cars, and upgrade the performance of said cars. These were big changes, and while some people might not have been so keen on these changes, with the release of Need for Speed in 1994 and other racing games that would soon hit the market, such as the release of Gran Turismo 1 just 1 year later in 1997, these changes were necessary for the Ridge Racer series to stay competitive in the rapidly evolving racing game genre. These changes gave Rage Racer a much needed sense of structure and growth. Rage Racer featured 4 fictional manufacturers, and each manufacturer had unique designs and hidden unlockable models. Rage Racer also saw the emergence of the now iconic Ridge Racer mascot, Rico Nagas. While she was an unnamed character in Rave Racer, Rage Racer was when she received her iconic name and became a core part of the Ridge Racer identity. Leaning more into the simcade category like that of Gran Turismo, Rage Racer was more serious and grounded compared to its predecessors. There was a layer of strategy involved in Rage Racer, which gave it a sense of new life. It wasn't as flashy as the entries preceding it, but it had substance, and fans loved it. Rage Racer introduced an edgier tone compared to its predecessors. The bright, arcade-like aesthetic of the original Ridge Racer was replaced with darker visuals, more realistic textures, and an overall grittier vibe that stayed consistent across the 4 selectable circuits. Although the focal shift divided some players, Ridge Racer proved that the series could evolve without losing its identity. Its emphasis on progression and customization set it apart from earlier Ridge Racer titles. It planted the seeds for features that would become staples in future racing games. By experimenting with new ideas, Ridge Racer carved out a unique space in the franchise's history. Here it is, Ridge Racer Type 4, widely considered the crowning jewel of the Ridge Racer series. It took inspiration from its predecessor, Rage Racer, but amplified to new heights. Progression continued to be a major focal point, and in Ridge Racer Type 4, the game featured a story-driven Grand Prix mode. In this mode, players signed up with one of 4 teams. Each team had their own backstory, cars, and vibe. Each of the 4 racing teams you could join had its own manager, complete with storylines, rivalries, and personal struggles that unfolded as you progressed through the Grand Prix. It was a surprising layer of depth for a racing game in 1998, and it gave players a reason to replay the campaign multiple times just to see every storyline. This was way more than just racing. It was an experience with clear mood, tone, and artistic vision. There was clear love and passion put into it. It was very cool. The cool factor was amplified even greater thanks to the game's large variety of circuits to race on, over 300 unlockable vehicles, as well as gorgeously animated cinematics and clean UI. Fans of the series often consider the UI of Ridge Racer Type 4 the best of the entire series. Ridge Racer Type 4 was not only stylish, but filled to the brim with content that would keep players hooked for hours. It was one of the first racing games that treated presentation like a part of the gameplay itself. It looked cool, sounded cool, and felt awesome to play. Ridge Racer Type 4 is a beloved PlayStation 1 classic. For many, it represents the pinnacle of the Ridge Racer saga. Between its incredible presentation, storytelling, and gameplay refinements, Type 4 is often regarded as the peak of Ridge Racer's artistic ambition. Ridge Racer Turbo wasn't a standalone entry, but rather a high-tech demo included with Ridge Racer Type 4. For 1998 standards, Ridge Racer Turbo was very impressive. It was a remastered version of the original Ridge Racer arcade game. It ran at a buttery smooth 60 FPS, 50 in PAL regions, which back in 1998 was way ahead of its time. There are games released today that don't run at 60 FPS. So back in 1998, a game running at 60 FPS was almost unheard of due to the technological limitations of the time. Ridge Racer Turbo featured improved textures, had vibration feedback, and came with 2 special cars. Those cars were the White Angel and 13th Racing cars from the PlayStation port of Ridge Racer 1. While Turbo wasn't a full game, it still has its place in the Ridge Racer history book due to the innovation and technological advances it presented that would later materialize in future full-on Ridge Racer releases. Now on to Ridge Racer 64. This was my first Ridge Racer game, and I absolutely loved it. I was born the year Ridge Racer 64 came out, so I didn't play it until much later, but I remember those random Saturdays and Sundays back in 2007 and 2008 where I had nothing to do and I would spend a few hours playing Ridge Racer 64 on the family Nintendo 64. It was so much fun. Personal tangent aside, Ridge Racer 64 came out towards the end of the Nintendo 64's running, which was quite sad as it was very good and a lot of people missed out. With the release of the PlayStation 2 the same year, a lot of people had moved on from the Nintendo 64 and subsequently skipped Ridge Racer 64 for Ridge Racer 5, but more on that later. Like the previous entries, Ridge Racer 64 was developed by Namco Studios, but this time around, they had help from Nintendo's software technology team. With this change, Ridge Racer 64 was a bold attempt to reinvent the series for a different audience. Luckily, that attempt worked out. The game featured a variety of tracks, which were a mix of old classics combined with new environments specifically designed for the Nintendo 64's strengths. Ridge Racer 64 also came packed with 32 unlockable cars, ranging from well-known Ridge Racer classics to new cars that had never previously been seen in the series. Ridge Racer 64 maintained the signature Ridge Racer feel of drifty cornering, responsive handling, and bright arcade visuals. However, it was all put together in a way that gave it a new and refreshing feeling. It ran very smoothly for N64 standards, and the physics struck a perfect balance between Ridge Racer's roots and what N64 players were already used to with games like Mario Kart 64. Ridge Racer 64 wasn't crazily groundbreaking, but it proved that the franchise could successfully branch out beyond Sony's ecosystem while staying true to its core gameplay. Ridge Racer 64's multiplayer mode also deserves a mention. 4 players could go head-to-head using split screen, which is something no Ridge Racer before it had offered. This made Ridge Racer 64 one of the best party racing games on the N64, holding its own alongside titles like Mario Kart 64 and Diddy Kong Racing. It's 2000. At this point, the Ridge Racer series had spent the previous 7 years dominating arcades around the globe as well as home PlayStation 1 consoles. The PlayStation 2 had just dropped, and along with it came a new entry in the Ridge Racer series. This was, of course, Ridge Racer 5. This game was a launch title for the PlayStation 2 and ushered the series into the next generation of gaming. Ridge Racer 5 embraced clean, fast arcade racing while remaining grounded and simple. While racers like Gran Turismo were getting heavier into simulation, and Need for Speed was getting heavier into the tuner scene, Ridge Racer 5 struck the core of what made the franchise so great in the first place. That, of course, being fun and fast-paced arcade racing on tight and stylish circuits featuring many of the classic Ridge Racer cars fans had grown to love. All of this was combined in a package that didn't require hours of grinding or massive time commitment like other games. Ridge Racer 5 was also the first fully fledged Ridge Racer game that ran at 60 FPS, which made the game feel incredible. The game also featured vastly improved lighting, reflections, and car models that took full advantage of everything the PlayStation 2 brought to the table. Besides that, the game introduced the Ridge City Grand Prix, which was a structured Grand Prix mode that allowed players to climb through the ranks, unlock new cars, and face off against increasingly aggressive and challenging AI drivers. There was a much greater sense of progression here, while staying grounded in the original Ridge Racer formula. There was also the return of the 13th Racing Team, which added a fun sense of time attack rivalry. Facing off against those guys felt like a rite of passage and was incredibly rewarding upon reigning victorious over them. There was also the return of the franchise's long-standing virtual mascot, that of course being Rico Nagas, featured in one of the most memorable intro cutscenes in the entirety of the Ridge Racer series. Ridge Racer 5 didn't reinvent the Ridge Racer formula, but that wasn't the point, and it didn't need to. It did, however, introduce a drafting mechanic, which added a new layer of strategy to the races. Players could race on 7 unique tracks, each with reverse variants, which brought the total to 14 playable layouts. The sleek cities and stunning coastal routes of Ridge Racer 5 looked great and felt great to play, which could be enjoyed in any one of the 15 cars featured in the game. With the release of the Nintendo DS in 2004, Namco revisited their N64 experiment of Ridge Racer 64 and put a portable twist on it. This materialized in the form of Ridge Racer DS. This was essentially a remake of Ridge Racer 64, but specifically tailored and reinvented for the Nintendo DS. The game featured a handful of tracks and over 30 unlockable cars, which was very impressive given the hardware limitations of the original Nintendo DS. The most ambitious aspect of Ridge Racer DS was incorporating the DS touchscreen for analog-style steering. This allowed players to steer by sliding their thumb along the screen. It was very creative and took full advantage of what the Nintendo DS offered. It was very much in line with Nintendo's motto of try something new, although, depending on who you asked, the execution was really hit or miss. The good news was that traditional button controls were still an option. Ridge Racer DS also supported wireless multiplayer. The Nintendo DS had the ability to link up with other DS handhelds through Wi-Fi, which means multiple people could all play together while only needing one cartridge. The visuals and performance of Ridge Racer DS weren't anything spectacular, but the game gets major points in the effort and ambition department. Ridge Racer DS was far from perfect, but it brought a new generation of handheld players to the world of Ridge Racer. It's 2004. In response to Nintendo's newly released DS, Sony hit back with the release of the PlayStation Portable, otherwise known as the PSP. With this, Namco saw this as an opportunity to release another Ridge Racer title. On one hand, Namco gave the Nintendo DS Ridge Racer DS, then on the other hand was the PSP, and it received Ridge Racers. Ridge Racers was more than just a lazy port. It was a combination of several previous Ridge Racer titles all put into one awesome modernized and reinvented package. Ridge Racers was a masterfully curated experience, and having personally played it on my own PSP growing up, I can attest to how good this game was. I admittedly didn't play it often, but whenever there was a family road trip, I'd whip out my PSP, plop in Ridge Racers, and I'd be hooked the entire car ride. It made time go by in a blink of an eye because of how fun and immersive it was. The game ran at 60 FPS, which was very impressive considering the PSP was a handheld and wasn't nearly as powerful as its PS2 older brother. Ridge Racers was very impressive. It looked crisp on the PSP's screen and took inspiration from Need for Speed titles of that era by introducing nitrous boost mechanics. This gave Ridge Racers a new burst of strategy and speed and made it stand out over its predecessors. The most impressive thing about Ridge Racers was that despite being on a handheld, it felt like a full-blown console experience with how content-rich it was. The game featured dozens of cars across 8 fictional manufacturers, including familiar names like Kamada, Danver, and Assoluto. There were also high-performance special class vehicles to unlock. These cars were unlockable by completing various in-game challenges. To unlock the Rally X car, players must complete Pro Tour 18, as well as obtain a score of 50,000 in the Rally X minigame. It can be played before the intro sequence or at any time under the game's options menu. Ridge Racers also featured a large variety of tracks, which were pulled from prior entries like Ridge Racer Arcade, Ridge Racer Revolution, Rave Racer, and Ridge Racer Type 4. Many of these tracks were available in both forward and reverse layouts. This was unbelievably impressive for a handheld console like the PSP. Ridge Racers managed to feel like both a celebration of Ridge Racer's legacy and a fresh new start on portable hardware. In 2005, Microsoft launched the Xbox 360. Now being in the 7th generation of consoles, it was the perfect time for Namco to release another title in the Ridge Racer series, this time being Ridge Racer 6. The Xbox 360 was vastly more powerful than the consoles preceding it, so Ridge Racer 6 was pushed to much greater heights thanks to the power of the 360. While the Xbox 360 is pretty slow by modern standards, back in 2005 it was as good as home game consoles got. And with the emergence of high-definition televisions, games saw a drastic increase in graphical fidelity. Ridge Racer 6 brought the franchise into the HD era, and it was great. Not only did the game look good, but Ridge Racer 6 introduced the World Explorer mode, which was a massive mode that featured 235 races across a bunch of different environments. Players had the ability to plan their racing path through a massive interconnected map of events, which granted players agency over how they progressed. This was very innovative compared to the more linear approach of other racers at the time. As players worked through the World Explorer mode, they would unlock additional cars and content along the way. Speaking of cars, the car roster of Ridge Racer 64 was massive. Including DLC, the game featured 9 manufacturers, 36 base models, and a total of 169 variations across those 36 models. It was the largest car lineup in the series at the time, including multiple performance tiers and unlockable special class vehicles. The game also carried over the nitrous boost system from the PSP Ridge Racer titles. Ridge Racer was no longer an obscure, quirky PlayStation exclusive, but a multi-console powerhouse that put up a serious fight against Gran Turismo, Need for Speed, and Project Gotham Racing. Ridge Racer 6 also featured online multiplayer, the return of the beloved time attack mode, and even DLC for cars and additional in-game music. Ridge Racer 6 was way ahead of its time. Ridge Racer 6 maintained the core of the original Ridge Racer arcade, but with the newfound power of the Xbox 360, it allowed Namco to increase the scope and take Ridge Racer to new heights previously not possible. One last notable aspect of Ridge Racer 6 was that it was the first in the series to introduce distinct performance differences between cars. When I say that, while the cars in previous Ridge Racer titles had differences between them, they all felt pretty similar despite those differences. Ridge Racer 6 was the first time those differences were meaningfully noticeable thanks to the game's more complex physics engine. For example, the Star Nose offered sharper drifting and faster nitrous charging at the cost of grip. This was a big shift and added a new layer of strategy and planning to the game. Players were forced to choose cars based on track layout and racing style. The year is 2006. The PSP had been out for a couple years at this point and grew massively popular. It had been 2 years since Ridge Racers came out, and Ridge Racer fans were craving another release. Namco responded by releasing Ridge Racers 2. Similar to the transition between Ridge Racer 1 Arcade and Ridge Racer 2 Arcade, the transition between Ridge Racers and Ridge Racers 2 was more like a significant overhaul rather than a brand new sequel that drastically changes the formula. Ridge Racers 2 was essentially the ultimate edition of Ridge Racers. The game featured all the tracks from Ridge Racers as well as several new additions, bringing the total to over 40 when including reverse variants. These tracks could be enjoyed between 62 cars across 8 fictional manufacturers. This time around, there were even more special class high-performance cars to be unlocked. Ridge Racers 2 was jam-packed with near endless replayability. There was of course the beloved time trial mode, as well as other modes like Duel, Survival, and World Tour. If you got bored of one mode, there was always another mode to try out to always keep things fresh and interesting. The opening cinematics were also back and as great as ever. By this point, it's safe to say that Ridge Racer on PSP had fully cemented itself as the king of portable arcade racing. These games were fast, fun, and loaded with everything fans loved about the franchise. And the fact that this all fit in your pocket, it made it all the better. It was said that these games were everything good about the original games, and then some, and there's no lie in that statement. Another element that made Ridge Racers 2 shine was the level of polish in its presentation. The soundtrack was expanded with a wide selection of music taken from previous entries in the series. The game featured a mix of classic arcade tracks alongside fresh remixes. The visuals were equally impressive, featuring detailed car models, vibrant track environments, and a steady 60 frames per second that kept the game crisp and fluid. Paired with sleek menus and clean HUD design, Ridge Racers 2 was more than just a simple follow-up of Ridge Racers. Ridge Racers 2 felt like a full showcase of what the Ridge Racer series had achieved up to that point and acted as a celebration of the series' legacy. For many fans of the series, Ridge Racers 2 was not only the definitive portable racer but also one of the strongest entries in the franchise as a whole. To coincide with the PSP release of Ridge Racers 2 in September 2006, just 2 months later in November 2006, Namco Studios released Ridge Racer 7 in Japan and North America. The game was released to Europe in March 2007. This game never had an Xbox 360 release and went back to being Sony exclusive. Ridge Racer 7 was a launch title for the PlayStation 3, and this game felt like the definitive Ridge Racer of the HD era. It ran at 1080p, 60 FPS, looked amazing, and continued to take inspiration from Need for Speed by offering even deeper car customization than ever before. The game featured body kits, performance tuning, liveries, and more. While previous Ridge Racer titles offered customization, Ridge Racer 7 was the first time it was this deep and intricate. This helped Ridge Racer 7 stand out and made it feel new and exciting. The game featured over 40 tracks, including reverse layouts, an awesome online mode, and plenty of unlockable content ranging from special cars to plug-in units for your cars. Although some players felt that the grind was a bit much, if you were looking for classic Ridge Racer gameplay but enhanced with modern features, Ridge Racer 7 was exactly that. Thanks to the enhanced capabilities of the PlayStation 3 over its predecessors, Namco expanded Ridge Racer 7 in ways that weren't previously possible due to the technological limitations of earlier consoles. With extensive customization options for body kits, performance tuning, and visual upgrades, the game featured 27 base models across 10 manufacturers. However, when you include all unlockable variants and special machines, the total car roster expands to roughly 40, and some fan pages count as many as 73 distinct entries. It's a little unclear, but whatever the case, players had a large variety of cars to choose from in Ridge Racer 7. To top it all off, Ridge Racer 7's career mode, called Ridge State Grand Prix, offered a structured progression system with dozens of races across multiple classes. Players earned credits to purchase and upgrade cars, unlock manufacturers, and fine-tune both performance and appearance. The branching race tree added depth and replayability, which gave players more control over how they progressed. Ridge Racer 7 was a complete package that defined the HD era of the series. Ridge Racer 7 was incredible. It was stylish, fast-paced, had a great soundtrack, and looked and felt great at 1080p, 60 FPS. With the launch of the Nintendo 3DS, Ridge Racer made its return to handheld gaming with Ridge Racer 3D. This time, it came with a new twist, fully stereoscopic 3D visuals. While many early 3DS games struggled to make meaningful use of the 3D effect, Ridge Racer 3D actually benefited from it. The added depth made races feel more immersive, especially during high-speed drifts, tunnel sections, and long corners where the sense of speed really popped. Ridge Racer 3D featured 18 cars from classic Ridge Racer manufacturers. The game also featured 15 tracks, many of which were carried over from previous games like Ridge Racer 6 and Ridge Racers on PSP. Each track was available in both forward and reverse layouts, offering plenty of variety and replay value. The game stuck closely to the series' signature drift-based mechanics, but refined them slightly to better suit the 3DS controls. While the analog nub on the 3DS wasn't perfect, it still managed to feel responsive and fun, which was crucial for a game that relies so heavily on precision cornering. The Grand Prix mode in Ridge Racer 3D was pretty basic. It wasn't as complex or in-depth as Ridge Racer 6 and 7, but it didn't need to be. Ridge Racer 3D was the first handheld Ridge Racer title since Ridge Racers 2 on PSP, so Ridge Racer 3D was more meant to test the waters of a new mobile platform rather than acting as a huge evolutionary step forward in the Ridge Racer formula. However, Ridge Racer 3D also included a few extras that added to its value. Quick Tour mode allowed players to jump into a randomly generated set of races based on difficulty, race length, and car class. This was perfect for quick pick-up and play sessions. Duel mode gave players a one-on-one challenge against rival cars, and there were time attack and street pass features for racing against the clock and sharing ghost data. Multiplayer was limited to local wireless only of up to 4 players, but the core single-player content was substantial enough for a handheld racer on a new handheld console. Visually, the game was sharp for early 3DS standards, and the sense of scale in some of the larger environments was impressive considering the hardware limitations of the 3DS. Ridge Racer 3D was not a massively evolutionary title in the Ridge Racer series, but it didn't need to be. It successfully brought that classic Ridge Racer feel to a new generation of handheld hardware. It showed off what the 3DS could do while staying true to the franchise's roots. For longtime fans, it was nice to finally have Ridge Racer back in their pocket again. Ridge Racer 3D was fast, stylish, and just as fun as ever. The PlayStation Vita was a powerful handheld. It had dual analog sticks, a sharp OLED screen, and more power than any portable system that came before it. A perfect candidate for a new Ridge Racer game, right? Sadly, what players got in 2012 was one of the most underwhelming entries in the entire series. Ridge Racer for PS Vita launched with beautiful graphics, tight controls, and smooth 60 FPS gameplay. On a technical level, it looked and played like a dream. But the problem wasn't how it felt, rather what it lacked. The game launched with only 3 tracks and 5 playable cars, and nearly everything else was locked behind a paywall of downloadable content. The plan, according to Namco, was to build out the experience post-launch through DLC packs, but it backfired hard. Players expected a full Ridge Racer experience on day one, and instead got what felt like a glorified demo. The core gameplay was still there, drifting felt great, the UI was clean, and the soundtrack, while smaller than usual, featured some quality techno and electronic tracks. It even offered a few remixes of older Ridge Racer tracks. But none of that could make up for the game's lack of content. There was no traditional career mode, no structured single-player progression, and the online multiplayer, while functional, couldn't carry the game alone. Most players were left wondering what the point was. There were some interesting features though. For instance, the game introduced a team-based mechanic called the Planetary League, where players aligned with one of 4 racing teams. Each team had its own identity and global leaderboard. That concept had potential, and the competitive elements gave the game a slight edge in online play. But again, the lack of actual content undermined whatever good ideas the game had. Critics and longtime fans were vocal in their disappointment. Many saw it as a cash grab, or at the very least, a half-baked experiment that didn't do justice to the franchise's legacy. Given how powerful and capable the PS Vita was for a 2011 handheld, this should have been a highlight of the system's launch window. Instead, it was the lowest rated Ridge Racer game of all time. It wasn't a bad game at its core, it just wasn't a full game. And for a series with such a rich history of content, style, and arcade racing greatness, Ridge Racer Vita felt like a betrayal. The game was a huge missed opportunity. It had the foundation, the tech, and the legacy, but it lacked the heart and passion of previous Ridge Racer titles. By 2012, the racing genre was shifting and had been for several years at this point. Games like Burnout and Need for Speed were emphasizing chaos and destruction in vast open worlds rather than realistic racing on closed circuits. When Namco announced a new Ridge Racer game called Unbounded, many assumed it would be a natural evolution of the series. What they got instead was something completely different. Developed by Bugbear Entertainment, best known for their work on the Flatout series, Ridge Racer Unbounded was an attempt to reboot the franchise. Rather than sticking with the high-speed drifts and vibrant environments that the Ridge Racer series was so known for, Unbounded took a sharp turn toward urban destruction and cinematic mayhem. The bright, vibrant environments were gone, and their place were dark, gritty city streets filled with destructible buildings, roadblocks, and set-piece explosions. It felt more like Burnout or Split Second than Ridge Racer. The core gameplay focused heavily on aggressive racing and destruction. Players could smash through walls, ram opponents off the road, and build up a power meter to unleash devastating attacks. The game introduced a frag system that rewarded takedowns and reckless driving. It was fast and intense, and for players who wanted pure mayhem, it scratched that itch. There was also a surprisingly robust track editor that let players create custom courses and share them online, offering long-term replay value for those who wanted to get creative. Visually, Unbounded looked fantastic. The environments were detailed, the particle effects from debris and explosions were impressive, and the sense of speed was strong. All of this could be enjoyed across the 9 city districts and more than 50 cars featured in the game. The soundtrack leaned into heavy rock and industrial electronic music, which fit the gritty tone but felt far removed from the iconic soundtracks of earlier Ridge Racer games. The entire game had an edgy vibe that older entries never touched, other than perhaps Rage Racer on a small scale. However, the departure from Ridge Racer's roots was the biggest point of contention. While Unbounded was a competent and exciting arcade racer in its own right, it lacked the original identity that had carried the franchise for nearly 2 decades at this point. The precise drift-based mechanics were replaced with heavier, physics-based handling. Longtime fictional manufacturers and signature cars were largely absent. The clean, futuristic aesthetics had been swapped out for urban decay. Longtime fans struggled to see the Ridge Racer name in what was essentially a completely different game. Critically, the game received mixed reviews. Some praised it for taking risks and offering a fresh take on the Ridge Racer series. Others criticized it for being derivative, unfocused, and too far removed from what Ridge Racer was supposed to be. The sales weren't strong enough to justify a follow-up, and Unbounded quietly faded into the abyss of irrelevancy shortly after it launched. In hindsight, Ridge Racer Unbounded was more of a spin-off than a proper sequel. It was an experiment that attempted to reimagine and chase industry trends instead of doubling down on the things that made the franchise originally special. It simply didn't feel like Ridge Racer and ultimately missed the mark for fans of the series. Ridge Racer Slipstream launched in late 2013 on iOS and early 2014 on Android. Slipstream was Namco's attempt to translate the Ridge Racer series into a modern, mobile package while offering close to everything that made the series great on arcades and consoles. Unlike some of the lightweight mobile Ridge Racer spin-offs before it, Slipstream offered a surprisingly full-featured experience. The core of the game was its Grand Prix mode, consisting of 12 championships with 18 races each for a total of 216 races to complete. To support that, the game included 12 tracks, each available in both forward and reverse layouts. While the environments were reused frequently across the championships, the design of the courses was unmistakably Ridge Racer. They featured wide corners, sweeping curves, and long straights. These tracks were built with drifting and drafting mechanics in mind. The car roster featured 16 cars in total, and each car had their own unique performance traits. Players could further customize their cars with over 300 customization options, including paint, decals, and tuning upgrades that allowed for noticeable differences in handling and speed. Slipstream stayed true to Ridge Racer's arcade roots by centering its gameplay on 2 mechanics: drifting and drafting. Drifting rewarded smooth, precise cornering, while the drafting mechanic allowed players to tuck in behind opponents for a powerful speed boost, which encouraged tactical positioning before overtakes. Another cool thing was that the controls were adapted with 2 options. The first option was tilt steering for motion controls. The second option was tap-based steering. Players could also choose between automatic or manual acceleration. Visually, Slipstream's graphics were very impressive considering it was a phone game. It ran smoothly on iOS and Android devices with sharp track detail, excellent car models, and effects that gave a strong sense of speed. Critics noted it was one of the better-looking racers on mobile in the early 2010s. It captured much of the look and feel of Ridge Racer on consoles. Reception was generally favorable. Reviewers praised how faithfully the game brought Ridge Racer's identity to phones and tablets. The game felt fast, skill-based, and satisfying to master. However, criticism surfaced around the repetitive track selection as players were racing the same circuits repeatedly across 200-plus races. There were also microtransactions. Unlocking cars or events often required heavy grinding unless players spent money to obtain those cars and events to avoid the grind, which, unsurprisingly, didn't sit well with a lot of people. Despite those issues, Slipstream represented one of the most complete Ridge Racer experiences on mobile phones. For fans who wanted arcade drifting fun in their pocket, it delivered. It certainly wasn't perfect, but it proved that Ridge Racer could still adapt to new platforms while holding on to its signature gameplay. It's October 2016, and Bandai Namco experimented again with mobile phones by releasing Ridge Racer Draw and Drift. This title marked the last official Ridge Racer release to date, and it took a more experimental approach than Slipstream. Where Slipstream tried to replicate the console Ridge Racer experience on mobile phones, Draw and Drift stripped things down and reimagined drifting as the centerpiece mechanic. Before each race, players drew their intended racing line on the circuit map, literally sketching the path they wanted their car to take. Once the race began, acceleration was automatic, and the player's primary interaction came from tapping drift zones. These zones were marked on the track in green and white and were used to execute slides. A narrower white band within the drift zone indicated a perfect drift area. This precision was rewarded with stronger speed boosts. The main single-player campaign, Ridge Racer World Cup, unfolded across Ridge City, the series' long-standing urban setting. As players progressed and leveled up, they unlocked the Legend League, a tougher series of events overseen by Jin Kazama, who also serves as a boss. This helped give the game a small sense of narrative progression. The car list featured about a dozen unlockable cars, each with their own strengths and power, handling, and nitro boost. The track roster included several compact city-based circuits, each designed for quick races suitable for mobile play meant to pass time. The short race length, combined with the draw and drift mechanic, made it easy to play in bursts. Online multiplayer was also supported, letting players compete against others worldwide. Graphically, Draw and Drift was clean and sharp, with crisp track environments and an interface designed for quick navigation. It looked polished for a mid-2010s phone game, but its presentation leaned more toward accessibility than realism, signaling a different priority than Slipstream's more ambitious scope. The game received mixed reception. Some players found the draw your line mechanic a clever and fresh take on Ridge Racer's drift tradition, especially for phone users who prefer simplicity over complex controls. The short races and simplified gameplay loop made it easy to jump in and play, but longtime fans were less enthusiastic. With few tracks and a very light progression system, content was limited, and the novelty of tracing circuits wore off after repeated play. Many felt it lacked the depth, replayability, and excitement of traditional Ridge Racer titles. Draw and Drift ultimately stands as the final official Ridge Racer release to date. While it experimented with new ideas and embraced a mobile-first design, it also highlighted the series' struggle to find its place in a gaming landscape dominated by so much competition from other racers like Need for Speed, Burnout, Forza, and Gran Turismo. For fans, it felt like a painful acknowledgement of how Ridge Racer had lost its way. However, it was also a bittersweet note that the series that once defined arcade drifting had reached its end. And given the fact that it's been 9 years since the release of Draw and Drift, it's unlikely we'll see another Ridge Racer title. From its debut in the arcades in 1993 to its last main entries in the 2010s, Ridge Racer built a reputation as one of the most exciting racing franchises in gaming. It was never about realism. It was about speed, drifting, music, and atmosphere. Few games captured the thrill of sliding through a corner with the same energy that Ridge Racer delivered. Each era of the series added something unique. Ridge Racer 1 set the foundation and established the Ridge Racer formula. Rage Racer gave it a darker tone and progression systems. Type 4 expanded the storytelling and presentation. The handheld games like Ridge Racer PSP showed how well the formula could work on the go. And even the smaller experiences such as Ridge Racer DS or Ridge Racer 3D carried forward the same core ideas of drifting and arcade-style fun. Ridge Racer Unbounded experimented with adding destruction elements to the formula, while Slipstream adapted the classic Ridge Racer experience for mobile players. Fans of the series continue to hold on to memories of their favorite entries. Ridge Racer showed that racing games could be simple, yet remain incredibly fun. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking, subscribing, and leaving a comment down below. Thank you for watching.